The cuffs clicked shut around the wrists of the two men in suits, their badges glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights of the police precinct. Officer James Marshall smirked, enjoying the moment. He tugged the two black men forward roughly, ignoring their quiet protests. The younger of the two, a broad-shouldered man with a clean-shaven head, glanced at his partner. "Officer," he said, voice calm but firm, "this is a mistake. You might want to check our badges again." Marshall scoffed. "Nice try," he sneered, leaning in close. "I don't care if you stole those from some real cops. You're not walking out of here." The room fell silent as the two men exchanged a knowing look. Slowly, the older man turned toward Marshall, his eyes hard as steel. "You just arrested two police captains," he said, voice low and deliberate. "Your career is over." For a moment, the words didn't register. Then, like a sledgehammer, they hit. Marshall's smirk faltered, and his grip on their arms slackened. He fumbled for their IDs, his face growing pale as he flipped them open. Captain Robert Harris, the badge read. The other, equally damning, Captain Daniel Reed. Marshall's stomach churned. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He had no time to react as the precinct door swung open, and in strode the police commissioner, flanked by several senior officers. They stopped dead, their eyes falling on the scene. "What the hell is going on here?" the commissioner demanded, voice like a whip. Marshall's mouth opened, but no words came out. The commissioner's eyes darkened as he turned toward the two captains. "You're both free to go," he said firmly. Then, his gaze snapped back to Marshall. "As for you." The room seemed to close in, the air thick with tension. Marshall knew whatever came next wouldn't be good. It had all started earlier that day, a seemingly normal shift for Officer Marshall. Known around the department for his no-nonsense attitude, Marshall prided himself on his sharp instincts. But those instincts had often landed him in hot water. Patrolling the downtown area, Marshall had spotted the two men walking out of a jewelry store. They were dressed sharply, carrying briefcases and chatting casually. To Marshall, they looked out of place. He decided to follow them. When they entered a coffee shop and sat down, Marshall made his move. Approaching them under the guise of a routine check, he demanded their identification. The younger man, Captain Reed, raised an eyebrow but complied. His partner, Captain Harris, did the same, his expression unreadable. Marshall barely glanced at their badges before accusing them of carrying fake IDs. "You're under arrest," he said smugly, cuffing them both before they could protest further. Other officers in the precinct were surprised when Marshall marched in with the two captains in tow. But no one questioned him. Marshall had a reputation for pushing boundaries. Now, standing in the precinct, he wished he had been more careful. The commissioner's presence alone was enough to send a chill down his spine. But worse was the icy silence from Captains Harris and Reed. The commissioner wasn't done. He turned to Harris and Reed, his tone shifting to one of respect. "Captains, I apologize for this disgraceful incident. Rest assured, it will be dealt with immediately." Harris nodded curtly. "We trust you'll handle it appropriately," he said, his voice carrying an unspoken weight. Reed added, "We'll be filing a formal complaint. This isn't just about us. It's not the culture you've allowed to fester here." Marshall swallowed hard, feeling the walls close in. The commissioner's face hardened. "Officer Marshall," he said coldly, "my office. Now." The walk to the commissioner's office felt like a march to the gallows. Once inside, the commissioner wasted no time. "What were you thinking?" he barked. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Those men are highly respected captains with impeccable records." Marshall tried to defend himself, mumbling about suspicious behavior, but the commissioner cut him off. "Enough," he snapped. "Your actions today have brought shame to this department. You'll face a full investigation, and I can guarantee the outcome won't be in your favor." Marshall's head spun. His career, his reputation, everything was slipping through his fingers. Outside the office, Harris and Reed stood waiting, their expressions unreadable. As Marshall exited, they didn't say a word, but their silence spoke volumes. The next few days were a whirlwind. News of the incident spread like wildfire, and soon the department was under intense scrutiny. Protesters gathered outside the precinct, demanding accountability. Marshall found himself at the center of a growing storm. His colleagues distanced themselves, and his once solid career seemed to be crumbling. But the worst was yet to come. One evening, as Marshall sat alone in his apartment, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You'll pay for what you've done." He stared at the screen, heart pounding. What did it mean? Suddenly, his apartment went dark. The power had been cut. Marshall stood, his pulse racing. In the shadows, he could hear faint footsteps approaching. The sound of a door creaking open sent a jolt of fear through him. Was someone inside? Marshall reached for his service weapon, only to realize he had left it at the precinct. He was completely vulnerable. The footsteps grew louder, closer. And then, silence. Marshall stood frozen in the darkness, his breathing shallow and rapid. The silence pressed down on him like a heavy weight. Every creak of the floorboards felt amplified, each one sending a shiver up his spine. "Who's there?" He called out, his voice shaky. No answer. He moved cautiously toward the door, his hands outstretched. The room was pitch black, and his mind raced with possibilities. Was this someone seeking revenge? A random intruder? Or was it connected to the mysterious message he'd received moments earlier? Just as his fingers brushed the doorknob, the sound of glass shattering in the kitchen made him jump. He spun around, heart hammering. The faint glow of streetlights outside offered just enough illumination to see the vague outline of the living room. Nothing seemed out of place, but his instincts screamed otherwise. "Show yourself," he shouted, trying to summon whatever authority he had left. Silence again. Marshall's mind flashed back to the events of the past few days. Ever since the incident with Captains Harris and Reed, his life had spiraled into chaos. His name was plastered across the media. Social media platforms buzzed with outrage, and even his neighbors avoided eye contact. But this felt different. This was personal. Gathering his courage, he moved toward the kitchen, stepping carefully. As he entered, he noticed shards of glass scattered across the floor. The window above the sink was shattered, and a cold breeze swept through the room. His phone buzzed again. Marshall fumbled to unlock it, his hands trembling. "You've crossed the line. Tonight, you'll understand what fear feels like." Marshall's throat tightened. He backed away slowly, his mind racing for options. Should he call the police? The irony wasn't lost on him. After all, he was one of them. Or at least he had been. Before he could decide, a sudden noise from the living room drew his attention. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was laughter, low, mocking, and unmistakably human. He whipped around, his eyes darting toward the sound. "Whoever you are, you're making a big mistake," he said, trying to steady his voice. The laughter grew louder, more taunting. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Marshall's phone buzzed again. He hesitated before looking at the screen. Checked the mirror. His blood ran cold. The only mirror in the living room was an old, full-length one hanging near the front door. He turned slowly, dread pooling in his stomach. In the dim light, the mirror reflected the empty room behind him. But as he stepped closer, he saw something else, writing, scrawled across the glass in what looked like red ink. "Your time is up." Marshall staggered back, his pulse pounding in his ears. His thoughts were a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Whoever was doing this knew how to get inside his head, and they were succeeding. He forced himself to think. He needed to get out of the apartment, find help, and figure out who was behind this. But as he reached for the door, a sudden knock echoed through the room, startling him. It wasn't a soft, tentative knock. It was loud and deliberate. Marshall froze, his hand hovering over the doorknob. "Who is it?" he called out, trying to sound confident. No response. The knock came again, louder this time. Swallowing his fear, Marshall unlocked the door and yanked it open. Standing on the other side was a figure dressed in a black hoodie, their face obscured by the shadows. "Who are you?" Marshall demanded, his voice cracking slightly. The figure didn't move or speak. Instead, they slowly raised their hand, holding up a phone. Marshall's phone buzzed once more. He glanced down at the screen. "You should have thought twice before you ruined lives." Marshall's head shot up, but before he could react, the figure turned and sprinted down the hallway. Marshall hesitated for only a second before giving chase. "Stop!" he shouted, bolting after them. The figure was fast, weaving through the building's corridors with ease. Marshall pushed himself to keep up, his lungs burning. They burst through the exit and into the alley behind the complex. The figure darted left, disappearing around a corner. Marshall followed, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he rounded the corner, he stopped dead in his tracks. The alley was empty. Marshall spun around, searching for any sign of his pursuer, but they were gone. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Defeated, he leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. His mind raced. Whoever this was, they were playing a dangerous game, and they had the upper hand. But as he stood there, something on the ground caught his eye. A small envelope lying near a pile of trash. It hadn't been there before. Cautiously, Marshall picked it up and tore it open. Inside was a single piece of paper with a simple message. This is only the beginning. Marshall's hands shook as he folded the paper and stuffed it into his pocket. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop, and deep down he knew why. The incident with Captains Harris and Reed had been more than just a mistake. It had been a glaring example of the systemic racism that plagued the force, and now someone was making sure he paid the price. But who, and how far were they willing to go? As Marshall made his way back to his apartment, his mind was filled with questions. He knew he was in for a long, sleepless night. What he didn't know was that the next 24 hours would push him to his limits and force him to confront the very system he had once trusted. Back in his apartment, the shattered window let in the cold night air. Marshall sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the cryptic messages on his phone. The words echoed in his mind, a chilling reminder that his actions had consequences. And the worst was yet to come. Marshall sat in his darkened apartment, the weight of the night pressing down on him. His eyes flicked to the mirror, where the ominous message still loomed in red. The room felt colder than before, the shattered window allowing the chill to creep in. He clutched the envelope in his hand, the cryptic warning echoing in his mind. This is only the beginning. His phone buzzed again. He hesitated before picking it up, half expecting another menacing message. Instead, it was a call from an unknown number. His thumb hovered over the screen. Finally, he answered. "Hello," he said, his voice low. Silence. "Who is this?" he demanded, his frustration mounting. A distorted voice crackled through the line. "You thought you could get away with it, didn't you?" Marshall's grip tightened on the phone. "What do you want from me?" The voice chuckled darkly. "Justice." Before Marshall could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone, his pulse racing. Whoever this was, they weren't just trying to scare him. They were out for retribution. He needed answers. Quickly, he logged into the department's internal system from his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He searched for recent reports, complaints, anything that might give him a clue about who could be behind this. But nothing stood out. His mind drifted back to Captains Harris and Reed. Could they be involved? No, it didn't make sense. They were professionals, respected leaders. This was something more personal, more vengeful. As he scrolled through the system, a notification popped up. An internal memo, mandatory meeting, Departmental accountability review. The commissioner had scheduled it for tomorrow morning, and all officers were required to attend. Marshall's stomach churned. The review was clearly a response to his actions, and he knew he'd be the focus. The hours dragged on, and sleep eluded him. Every creak of the apartment, every shadow, seemed to carry a threat. When dawn finally broke, Marshall felt no relief, only a growing sense of dread. He arrived at the precinct early, the tension palpable as he stepped inside. Officers who once greeted him with camaraderie now avoided his gaze. The atmosphere was heavy, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. The meeting room was packed, the commissioner standing at the front with a grim expression. Captains Harris and Reed were there too, their presence commanding attention. Marshall tried to avoid their gaze, but he felt the weight of their scrutiny. The commissioner began, his tone firm. Recent events have shed light on deeply troubling issues within our department. This meeting is the first step in addressing them. He spoke about accountability, systemic bias, and the need for change. But Marshall barely heard him. His mind was consumed by the events of the night before, the chilling messages, the shadowy figure. Then the commissioner's voice cut through his thoughts. "Officer Marshall, stand up." Marshall's heart sank as all eyes turned to him. He rose slowly, his hands clenched at his sides. The commissioner's gaze was steely. "Your actions last week were not only unacceptable, but a betrayal of the trust placed in you by this department and the community we serve." Marshall opened his mouth to speak, but the commissioner held up a hand. "You'll have your chance to explain yourself during the investigation. For now, consider yourself on administrative leave." The words hit Marshall like a punch to the gut. He felt the room close in around him, the weight of judgment heavy on his shoulders. As he left the meeting, whispers followed him. His colleagues' disdain was evident, their loyalty to the badge now a barrier between them and him. He pushed through the crowd, his head down, until he reached the exit. The cool morning air hit him as he stepped outside. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. But his reprieve was short-lived. Across the street, a group of protesters had gathered, their signs and chants a stark reminder of the department's tarnished reputation. One sign caught his eye: "No justice, no peace." Marshall's stomach knotted. The words felt like a personal indictment. As he turned to leave, he noticed a familiar face in the crowd, a young woman with piercing eyes and a determined expression. She held a sign that read, "We will not be silent." Their eyes met for a brief moment before she turned away, blending into the crowd. Something about her felt significant, but Marshall couldn't place it. Shaking his head, he walked to his car, the weight of the morning pressing down on him. Back at his apartment, he locked the door and collapsed onto the couch. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The meeting had been humiliating, but the real danger still loomed. Whoever was behind the threats wasn't done. As the day wore on, Marshall tried to piece together the puzzle. He revisited the events of the past week, searching for anything he might have missed. But the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. Someone was targeting him specifically, and they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the shadows in his apartment grew longer. Marshall felt a growing sense of unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Just as he was about to call it a night, his phone buzzed again. Another message, this time with an image attached. His heart pounded as he opened it. The photo showed him, sitting in his car outside the precinct earlier that day. The angle was close, too close for comfort. Beneath the photo was a single line of text, "We're watching." Marshall's blood ran cold. He sprang to his feet, his eyes darting to the window. He peered out into the dark street, searching for any sign of movement, but the street was empty, eerily quiet. He stepped back, his mind racing. Whoever this was, they were close, closer than he'd realized. Before he could process what to do next, there was a loud crash from the hallway. Marshall grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the door. His heart pounded as he pressed his ear against it, listening. The sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor, growing fainter with each passing second. Summoning his courage, Marshall yanked the door open and stepped into the hallway. At first, it seemed empty, but as he scanned the floor, his flashlight caught something, a small package, neatly wrapped and sitting just outside his door. His stomach churned as he picked it up. The weight of it felt ominous. He brought it inside, placing it carefully on the table. With a deep breath, he tore open the wrapping. Inside was a small black box. He hesitated, his fingers trembling as he lifted the lid. What he saw made his heart stop. Inside was a police badge, his badge. It was charred, the edges burned, as if it had been through a fire. Beneath it was a note, scrawled in the same red ink as the message on his mirror. "The fire you started will consume you." Marshall's hands shook as he read the words. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the air thick with fear. And then, as if on cue, his phone buzzed one more time. He didn't want to look, but he couldn't resist. The message was simple, but its meaning was clear. Next time, it won't just be a warning. Marshall sank into the chair, the weight of the threat pressing down on him. He was in deeper than he'd ever imagined, and now there was no turning back. Marshall stared at the charred badge, the weight of the message sinking in. Every instinct in his body told him he was in grave danger. Whoever was behind this wasn't just playing games, they were escalating. His phone buzzed again, breaking the silence. This time, it was a video. His hands trembled as he pressed play. The screen showed the interior of his apartment, the exact room he was sitting in, recorded from what appeared to be a hidden camera. In the video, Marshall was asleep on his couch, completely unaware of the intruder's presence. Then the camera panned to the figure in the black hoodie, standing silently over him, watching. The screen went dark, but the implication was clear. They had been inside his apartment, and he hadn't even known it. Marshall's stomach twisted. He shot up from his chair, frantically searching every corner of his apartment. He tore through the cabinets, pulled apart the cushions, and even checked under the bed. In the corner of the living room, near the bookshelf, he spotted it. A small, inconspicuous camera, barely the size of a button. He ripped it from its hiding spot and crushed it under his foot. His mind raced. If they'd been watching him, they knew everything, his habits, his routines, even his moments of vulnerability. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he'd never experienced before. Marshall grabbed his phone and dialed the commissioner's number. It rang twice before the familiar voice answered. "Marshall," the commissioner said, his tone sharp. "You'd better have a damn good reason for calling me this late." "There's someone after me," Marshall said quickly. "They've been inside my apartment. They're watching me." The commissioner sighed. "You're on administrative leave. Whatever trouble you've gotten yourself into, handle it on your own." "This isn't about that," Marshall snapped, his frustration boiling over. "They're targeting me because of what happened with Harris and Reed. They've escalated, and I need help." The commissioner was silent for a moment, then said, "Come to the precinct first thing in the morning. We'll talk." Marshall hung up, but the knot in his stomach remained. He knew he wouldn't make it through the night without taking some kind of action. Determined, he decided to visit the one person who might have answers, Captain Robert Harris. If anyone knew who might be behind this, it was him. Marshall grabbed his coat and left the apartment, constantly looking over his shoulder. The night air was cold, and the streets were mostly empty. He drove in silence, his thoughts racing. When he arrived at Harris's house, it was nearly midnight. The lights were on, and Marshall could see movement inside. He hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door. After a few moments, Harris opened the door, his expression shifting from surprise to suspicion. "Officer Marshall," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What are you doing here?" "I need to talk," Marshall said, his voice tense. "It's urgent." Harris studied him for a moment, then stepped aside to let him in. The house was warm, filled with the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Harris gestured for Marshall to sit. "Captain, I think someone's targeting me," Marshall began. "They've broken into my apartment, left messages, even planted cameras. And they're doing it because of what happened last week." Harris' expression hardened. "And you think I know something about it?" "I don't know," Marshall admitted. "But you and Reed, you're respected. You've been fighting against the kind of behavior I displayed. Maybe someone close to you is taking matters into their own hands." Harris leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. "You think we need to resort to threats and intimidation to seek justice?" Marshall hesitated. "I don't know what to think anymore, but this is real, and I need help." Harris was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "You brought this on yourself, Marshall. The system you've been a part of for years, it's crumbling under its own weight. People are angry, and they have every right to be." Marshall clenched his fists. "I made a mistake, and I'm paying for it. But whoever's doing this is going too far." Harris stood, his expression unreadable. "I'll tell you this much. If someone's targeting you, it's not us. But whoever it is, they're sending a message that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated anymore." Before Marshall could respond, there was a loud crash from outside. Both men jumped to their feet, rushing to the window. In the driveway, Marshall's car was on fire, flames licking at the night sky. The heat was intense, and the crackling of the flames filled the air. "Get back," Harris shouted, pulling Marshall away from the window as the fire grew. Marshall's heart raced as he watched his car burn. This was no random act. This was a direct threat, a clear sign that his tormentor was escalating. The sound of sirens in the distance brought a momentary sense of relief. Within minutes, firefighters arrived, dousing the flames, but the damage was done. The car was reduced to a smoldering heap of metal. Marshall stood in the driveway, his mind racing. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to scare him. They were making it clear that they wouldn't stop until he was completely broken. As the firefighters packed up and left, Harris approached him. "You need to take this seriously, Marshall. Whoever's doing this is sending a message, and they're not going to stop until you've learned your lesson, or worse." Marshall nodded, his jaw clenched. He was in deeper than he'd ever imagined, and the stakes were higher than he'd anticipated. But one thing was clear, he couldn't face this alone. As the night wore on, the weight of the threat hung heavy in the air, and Marshall knew that this was only the beginning of a battle that could cost him everything. Marshall stared at the charred remains of his car, his reflection flickering in the dying embers. His world was unraveling, and the person behind this was playing a dangerous game, one he wasn't sure how to win. Harris placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You need protection, Marshall," he said, his voice steady. "But first, you need to figure out who's doing this." Marshall nodded, but the knot in his stomach tightened. "I don't even know where to start. They've been one step ahead of me the whole time." Harris crossed his arms. "Let's think this through. Have you noticed anyone unusual around you recently? Someone who might have a personal grudge?" Marshall's mind raced, revisiting the last few weeks. Faces blurred together, colleagues, neighbors, even strangers on the street. Then his thoughts landed on the young woman from the protest. Her piercing gaze, the intensity in her eyes. Could she be involved? "There was someone," Marshall said slowly. "A protester. She was outside the precinct with the others. She stared at me like she knew me." Harris raised an eyebrow. "That's a start. Did you get a name?" Marshall shook his head. "No, but I can find out." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through photos and videos of the protest that had been circulating online. After a few minutes, he found her. In the video, she was holding her sign, chanting with the crowd. Her face was unmistakable. "Her," Marshall said, showing Harris the screen. "She's the one." Harris studied the image. "We'll need more than this. You'll have to dig deeper." Marshall sighed, the weight of the task pressing down on him. "I'll figure it out." Harris nodded. "In the meantime, you're staying here tonight. It's not safe for you to be alone." Marshall didn't argue. The thought of returning to his apartment, where the intruder had been, sent a shiver down his spine. The next morning, Marshall sat at Harris' kitchen table, a cup of coffee in hand. He barely touched it, his mind consumed by the events of the night before. Harris entered, his expression serious. "I've made some calls," Harris said, sitting across from him. "We'll have eyes on your apartment and the precinct, but you need to keep your head down." Marshall nodded, though he felt anything but safe. "What about the protester?" Harris slid a folder across the table. "This is everything we could find on her. Her name is Maya Brooks. She's been organizing protests against police misconduct for years." Marshall flipped through the folder. Maya's face stared back at him from photos of rallies and community events. Her name appeared in articles, her words fiery and direct. She was a voice for justice, someone who wouldn't back down. "She's been through a lot," Harris continued. "Lost her brother to police brutality 5 years ago. That's what sparked her activism." Marshall felt a pang of guilt. He had dismissed the protesters as nuisances, never considering the pain that drove them. "Do you think she's capable of this?" Marshall asked. Harris hesitated. "She has a motive. But setting a car on fire, breaking into your apartment, that's a different level. If she's behind this, she's not working alone." Marshall set the folder down, his jaw tight. "I need to talk to her." Harris frowned. "That's risky. If she's involved, she won't just confess. And if she's not, you could escalate things." "I don't have a choice," Marshall said firmly. "She's my only lead." Harris sighed. "Fine, but I'm coming with you." Later that day, they found Maya at a community center, leading a workshop on civic engagement. The room was filled with people of all ages, listening intently as she spoke. Marshall and Harris waited until the session ended. Maya noticed them as the crowd dispersed, her eyes narrowing. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone worried. Marshall stepped forward, trying to keep his voice calm. "We need to talk." Maya crossed her arms. "About what? More false accusations?" "This isn't about that," Marshall said. "Someone's targeting me. They broke it into my apartment, sent me threats, even burned my car. I think it might be connected to you." Maya's eyes widened, but she quickly masked her reaction. "You think I'm responsible?" "I don't know," Marshall admitted, "but I need answers." Maya studied him for a long moment, then said, "Let's talk somewhere private." She led them to a small office in the back of the center. Once inside, she closed the door and faced them. "I'm not behind this," Maya said firmly. "But I know people who are angry, angrier than me. If someone's targeting you, it's because they want you to feel what we've felt for years." Marshall frowned. "Who?" Maya hesitated, then said, "There's a group. They call themselves the Shadow of Justice. They don't just protest, they take action. I've tried to distance myself from them, but they don't care about playing by the rules." Marshall's pulse quickened. "Do you know how to find them?" Maya shook her head. "They're careful. They'd operate in the shadows, and they're always watching." The words sent a chill down Marshall's spine. He thought of the camera in his apartment, the messages, the fire. The Shadow of Justice was everywhere, and they had eyes on him. Before he could respond, Maya's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and her face paled. "What is it?" Harris asked. Maya showed them the message. "You're being watched. Stay out of this, or you'll be next." Marshall felt the weight of the threat settle over the room. The Shadow of Justice wasn't just targeting him. They were ready to silence anyone who got in their way. Maya looked up, her expression determined. "We need to stop them. Together." Marshall nodded, knowing the road ahead would be dangerous, but he also knew there was no turning back. The Shadow of Justice had declared war, and he had to face them head on. As they left the community center, Marshall's phone buzzed. Another message. "We warned you. Now you'll see what happens when you don't listen." Before he could respond, a loud explosion echoed from the distance. Marshall and Harris spun around, their eyes widening in horror. In the distance, thick black smoke rose into the sky. It was coming from the precinct. Marshall's heart sank. The Shadow of Justice had struck again, and this time the consequences were devastating. Marshall and Harris stood frozen as the distant column of black smoke twisted into the sky. The sirens blared seconds later, their shrill wails piercing the air. Marshall's mind raced, the implications of what had just happened crashing down on him like a tidal wave. "They've escalated," Harris said grimly, snapping Marshall out of his stupor. "We need to get to the precinct, now." Without hesitation, they jumped into Harris's car, Maya slipping into the back seat. As they sped through the city streets, the once familiar sound of sirens now felt deeply personal. "What do you think they hit?" Maya asked, leaning forward, her voice tense. "I don't know," Harris replied, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "But whatever it was, they're making a statement." Marshall sat in silence, his thoughts a tangled mess of guilt, fear, and anger. His mind replayed the messages, the threats, and the fire. He knew the shadow of justice was out for more than just retribution. They wanted to dismantle everything he had once believed in. As they approached the precinct, the full extent of the chaos came into view. The building's facade was blackened, smoke still billowing from broken windows. Officers and firefighters moved frantically, trying to contain the blaze and secure the area. Marshall's stomach churned as they stepped out of the car. The precinct had been his home for years, and now it was a smoldering ruin. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him. This wasn't just about him anymore. The commissioner was already on the scene, barking orders at a group of officers. When he spotted Marshall and Harris, his expression darkened. "What are you doing here, Marshall?" the commissioner demanded. "You're supposed to be on leave." "This isn't just about me," Marshall said, his voice firm. "The shadow of justice is behind this. They're targeting the entire department." The commissioner's eyes narrowed. "And you think showing up here helps? You're a liability right now." "He might be a liability," Harris interjected, "but he's also a target. If we want to stop this group, we need every piece of information we can get." The commissioner sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fine, but stay out of the way. We've got enough problems without you adding to them." Marshall nodded, though he felt the sting of the commissioner's words. He turned to Maya, who was taking in the scene with a mix of horror and determination. "Anything stand out to you?" Marshall asked. Maya shook her head. "They're smart. They know how to leave a message without leaving a trail." Just then, an officer approached with a grim expression. "Commissioner, we found something inside." The group followed the officer into the precinct. The damage inside was extensive: charred walls, shattered glass, and overturned furniture. But it wasn't just the destruction that caught their attention. In the center of the lobby, a large banner had been unfurled, its message written in bold black letters. "QORUPTIN Burns." Beneath it, a familiar badge had been placed, blackened at the edges. It was Marshall's. The commissioner's face darkened. "They're making this personal." Marshall's jaw tightened. "They want to send a message, but they're also trying to divide us. If we won't act fast, they'll keep pushing until the entire city turns against us." Maya stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the banner. "This isn't just about sending a message. They're rallying people. The more public their actions, the more support they'll gain." Harris nodded. "She's right. If they can position themselves as the heroes, they'll have the public on their side, and that makes them even more dangerous." The commissioner turned to his officers. "Get this cleaned up. I want every camera in a 5-block radius pulled. We're not letting them get away with this." As the officers got to work, Marshall pulled Maya and Harris aside. "We need to hit back, but we can't do it blindly. If we're going to stop them, we need to understand their next move." Maya hesitated, then said, "There's someone who might know more. He used to be part of the shadow of justice, but left when their methods got more extreme. If anyone can help us, it's him." "Where can we find him?" Harris asked. Maya glanced around, as if checking for eavesdroppers. "He runs a small bookstore on the east side. His name's Elijah." Marshall nodded. "Then that's where we're going." The drive to the east side was tense, the weight of the situation hanging heavy over the group. The city felt different now, tense, on edge. Every corner seemed to hold a potential threat. They arrived at a nondescript bookstore, its windows covered with faded posters, and its sign barely legible. Inside, the scent of old paper filled the air, and the shelves were packed tightly with books of all genres. Elijah was seated behind the counter, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a quiet demeanor. He looked up as they entered, his gaze lingering on Maya. "Didn't expect to see you here," Elijah said, his voice low. "And with company, no less." "We need your help," Maya said. "It's out the shadow of justice." Elijah's expression darkened. "I left that group for a reason. They'd gone too far." "They'd escalated," Marshall said. "They've attacked the precinct, targeted officers, and they're not stopping." Elijah sighed, leaning back in his chair. "They've been planning this for years. Every move is calculated. They want to dismantle the system, and they don't care who gets hurt in the process." "Do you know their next move?" Harris asked. Elijah hesitated, then nodded. "There's a rally planned for tomorrow night. They're going to use it to announce their next target. If you want to stop them, that's where you'll find them. Marshall felt a spark of hope. Where's the rally? Elijah scribbled an address on a piece of paper and slid it across the counter. But be careful, he warned. They'll be expecting resistance. If you walk into that rally unprepared, you won't walk out. Marshall pocketed the paper, his resolve hardening. We'll be ready. As they left the bookstore, the weight of their mission settled over them. The rally was their chance to confront the shadow of justice and put an end to their reign of terror. But Marshall knew the stakes. This wouldn't be just another confrontation. It would be a battle for the soul of the city, and failure wasn't an option. As they drove away, his phone buzzed once more. This time, the message was brief. Tomorrow, we finish what we started. Marshall clenched his fists. The shadow of justice was ready for war, and so was he. The air was thick with tension as Marshall, Harris, and Maya prepared for the rally. The address Elijah had provided led to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was the perfect spot for the shadow of justice to gather, a hidden location with plenty of exits. In the hours leading up to the event, the group gathered supplies, radios, a detailed map of the warehouse, and protective gear. Harris pulled some strings to get backup units stationed discreetly nearby, ready to move in if things went south. This is our only shot, Harris said, his tone serious. We need to get in, gather intel, and get out without blowing our cover. Marshall nodded, slipping a small recorder into his pocket. And if we're lucky, we'll identify their leader and put an end to this. Maya, who had been quiet most of the evening, finally spoke. They'll recognize me. If I walk in there, it could blow the whole operation. Marshall considered this. Then you stay outside and monitor the situation. If anything feels off, you let us know immediately. Maya didn't look happy about it, but she nodded. Be careful. These people won't hesitate to take you down if they suspect anything. As night fell, they made their way to the warehouse. The surrounding area was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant siren. They parked a few blocks away and approached on foot, keeping to the shadows. From their vantage point, they could see people gathering near the warehouse entrance. Some were wearing masks, while others kept their faces uncovered. A few carried signs with messages like "Justice for All" and "End Police Oppression." Marshall's eyes scanned the crowd, looking for familiar faces. He spotted one of the officers who had been with him during the precinct raid, now blending seamlessly among the protesters. They've infiltrated everywhere, Marshall muttered. Harris nodded. We stick to the plan. Get in, listen, and get out. They waited for the right moment, then slipped into the warehouse through a side entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Dozens of people filled the space, their voices echoing off the metal walls. A makeshift stage had been set up at the far end, where a masked figure was addressing the crowd. Marshall and Harris stayed near the back, keeping a low profile. The speaker's voice was amplified by a small sound system, their words sharp and deliberate. The system has failed us, the figure said, their voice distorted by a modulator. For too long, we've lived under the thumb of those who abuse their power. But no more. Tonight, we take the next step in our fight for true justice. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Marshall leaned closer to Harris. We need to get a better look at that speaker. Harris nodded. I'll circle around. You stay here and keep recording. As Harris moved toward the side of the room, Marshall focused on the stage. The speaker raised a hand, signaling for silence. Our next target, the figure announced, is the very heart of their power. We will expose their corruption and bring the truth to light. No more hiding. No more lies. Marshall's grip on the recorder tightened. He needed more details, something concrete to take back to the commissioner. The figure continued, their voice rising with each word. Tomorrow, we strike at the police commissioner himself. We will show the city that no one is above justice. Marshall's heart sank. They weren't just targeting the department, they were going straight for its leader. Before he could process the full weight of the revelation, a hand clamped down on his shoulder. He spun around, coming face to face with a man wearing a black mask. You don't belong here, the man growled. Marshall's cover was blown. He barely had time to react before the man shoved him backward, causing him to stumble into a nearby group of protesters. Get him, someone shouted. Chaos erupted. Marshall fought to keep his balance as more masked figures closed in. He threw a punch, connecting with one of them, but there were too many. Harris appeared out of nowhere, shoving people aside to reach him. We're compromised. Move. They pushed their way through the crowd, dodging fists and shouts. Marshall could see the side exit up ahead, their only way out. But just as they reached it, a loud voice boomed through the warehouse. "Stop them!" It was the speaker, now pointing directly at Marshall and Harris. Several people rushed to block their path. Marshall gritted his teeth. "We're not getting out of here without a fight." Harris nodded. "Then, let's give them one." The next few minutes were a blur of movement. Marshall and Harris fought their way through the crowd, using every ounce of their training to evade capture. But the odds were against them, and the walls of the warehouse seemed to close in. Just when it seemed like they were out of options, a loud crash echoed from the other side of the building. The side door burst open, and a squad of officers stormed in, weapons drawn. "Everyone on the ground," one of them shouted. The protesters scattered, some dropping to their knees while others bolted for the exits. The speaker on the stage quickly disappeared into the chaos, leaving their mask behind. Marshall and Harris seized the opportunity, sprinting toward the officers. "We need to go after their leader," Marshall shouted, but the officer in charge shook his head. "Our priority is securing the area. We'll sweep for suspects once it's safe." Marshall knew arguing would be pointless. Reluctantly, he followed the officers out of the warehouse. Outside, the night air was filled with the sounds of sirens and shouting. Maya ran up to them, her face pale. "What happened in there?" she asked. "They're going after the commissioner," Marshall said, his voice grim. "Tomorrow." Maya's eyes widened. "We need to warn him." "We will," Harris said. "But first, we need to regroup. This isn't over." As they drove away from the scene, Marshall couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The shadow of justice was more organized and determined than he had realized, and their next move would shake the city to its core. But one thing was clear: Marshall wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. The car ride back to Harris's house was tense, the weight of the shadow of justice's plan hanging over them. Marshall's mind raced, trying to piece together their next steps. The group had shown they were willing to escalate their attacks, and targeting the commissioner was their boldest move yet. Maya broke the silence. "We don't have much time. If they're planning to strike tomorrow, they've probably already set everything in motion." Harris nodded. "We need to warn the commissioner and put him under protection. But we also need to find out where and how they're going to attack." Marshall stared out the window, his jaw clenched. "We'll leave you one step ahead this time. No more reacting. We stop them before they get a chance to act." They arrived at Harris's home and immediately began strategizing. Maya pulled up her laptop, searching for any chatter or clues about the shadow of justice's next move. Harris contacted trusted officers, discreetly arranging for increased security around the commissioner. Meanwhile, Marshall sat down with the recording he had taken at the rally, replaying the speaker's words. Each phrase was deliberate, carefully chosen to incite and rally the group. But something about the way the speaker spoke, their cadence and choice of words, felt familiar. "Play that again," Maya said, leaning over his shoulder. Marshall rewound the recording and hit play. They listened intently, dissecting every word. "Listen to how they say corruption burns," Maya pointed out. "That phrasing? I've heard it before." Harris frowned. "Where?" Maya hesitated, then pulled up an old article from her files. It was an op-ed published in a local paper years ago, written by an anonymous activist. The title read, "Corruption Burns, a Call for True Justice." "Whoever wrote this has been in the movement for a long time," Maya said. "They've been planting seeds for years, shaping the message." Marshall's eyes narrowed. "Do we know who wrote it?" Maya shook her head. "It was published anonymously, but there were rumors about a former city official who left under suspicious circumstances. They were known for being outspoken about corruption in the department." Harris leaned forward. "Do you have a name?" Maya hesitated, then typed quickly, "James Calhoun. He used to be a deputy commissioner, but he disappeared after a scandal involving missing evidence in a high-profile case." Marshall's mind reeled. If he's behind this, it makes sense. He knows the system inside and out. He'd know exactly how to hit us where it hurts. Harris stood. "We need to find him. If Calhoun's the leader, you won't be working alone. They'll have people loyal to him, ready to carry out his orders." Maya nodded. "I'll start digging. If he's resurfaced, there has to be a trail." The hours ticked by as they worked tirelessly. Maya combed through public records, online forums, and social media, searching for any trace of Calhoun. Meanwhile, Harris coordinated with his contacts to tighten security around the commissioner. Just as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Maya sat up straight. "I found something." Marshall and Harris hurried over. On the screen was a series of transactions linked to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the industrial district. The name on the lease was fake, but the payment history was tied to a shell company that had been inactive since Calhoun's disappearance. "This has to be it," Maya said. "It's where they're operating from." Marshall grabbed his jacket. "Let's move. We need to hit them before they make their move." Harris held up a hand. "We can't rush in without a plan. We need backup, and we need to make sure the commissioner is safe." Marshall nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but we can't waste any more time." By mid-morning, they had gathered a small team of trusted officers and arrived at the industrial district. The warehouse loomed ahead, its rusted exterior blending in with the surrounding decay. Marshall surveyed the area. "They'll have lookouts. We need to be careful." Harris nodded, signaling for the team to split up and cover the exits. Maya stayed in the car, monitoring the situation through a radio link. As they approached the building, Marshall's heart pounded. Every sense was on high alert, every shadow a potential threat. They entered through a side door, weapons drawn. The inside of the warehouse was a maze of crates and machinery, the air thick with dust. Marshall signaled for silence, listening for any signs of movement. Then faintly, he heard voices coming from deeper within the building. They moved cautiously, following the sound. As they rounded a corner, they spotted a group of people gathered around a table, their attention focused on a large map spread out before them. At the head of the table stood a man with sharp features and a commanding presence. Even without introduction, Marshall knew who it was. "James Calhoun," he muttered. Calhoun looked up, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the intruders. Well, he said, his voice calm but filled with menace. "Looks like our guests have arrived." Before anyone could react, Calhoun shouted, "Now!" Suddenly, the warehouse erupted into chaos. Shadows moved as armed figures emerged from the corners, weapons raised. Marshall and Harris dove for cover as gunfire erupted, the sound deafening in the confined space. Marshall's mind raced as he returned fire, his focus narrowing to the immediate threat. They were outnumbered, but they had the element of surprise on their side. "Keep them pinned down," Harris shouted, signaling for the officers to hold their positions. Amid the chaos, Marshall spotted Calhoun slipping away, heading for a back exit. "He's staying away," Marshall yelled, breaking cover to pursue him. Harris called after him, but there was no time to argue. Marshall sprinted through the maze of crates, his eyes locked on Calhoun. The chase led them deeper into the warehouse, where the light was dim and the air thick with dust. Calhoun was fast, but Marshall was determined. Finally, they burst through a side door into an open courtyard. Calhoun turned, his face calm but his eyes blazing. "It's over, Calhoun," Marshall said, his weapon raised. "You're not getting away." Calhoun smirked. "You think you've won? You barely scratched the surface. The system you protect, it's already falling apart. And when it does, people like you will have nowhere to hide." Marshall stepped closer. "Drop the act. This ends now." But before he could move, the sound of tires screeching caught his attention. A black van sped into the courtyard, its side door sliding open. Calhoun backed toward it, his smirk never wavering. "You can't stop what's coming," he said as he climbed inside. Marshall raised his weapon, but the van was already speeding away. He fired, but the shots missed, and within moments, the van disappeared into the distance. Frustration boiled over as Marshall lowered his weapon. Calhoun had slipped through their fingers, but the fight was far from over. As he made his way back to the warehouse, the weight of Calhoun's words lingered in his mind. The battle against the shadow of justice was only beginning, and the stakes had never been higher. Marshall returned to the warehouse, his jaw tight with frustration. The sounds of gunfire had subsided, replaced by the muffled shouts of officers securing the area. Harris approached, his face grim. "What happened?" Harris asked. "Calhoun got away," Marshall said, his voice low. "A van picked him up. I couldn't stop it." Harris cursed under his breath. "We'll get him. For now, let's focus on what we found here." Inside the warehouse, officers were rounding up members of the shadow of justice. Some had surrendered without a fight, while others were being escorted out in cuffs. The map on the table was now in evidence bags, along with several laptops and documents. Maya entered the warehouse, her face pale but determined. "Any sign of Calhoun?" "He escaped," Harris said, "but we've got a treasure trove of information here. If we're lucky, something will lead us to him." Maya glanced at the laptops. "I can start analyzing these right away. If they've been communicating or planning from here, we'll find it." Marshall nodded. "Good. We need every lead we can get. Calhoun's not going to stop, and now he knows we're closing in." Back at Harris's home, the team regrouped. Maya set up her laptop and began sifting through the data they had recovered. Harris made calls, updating the commissioner and coordinating with other precincts to heighten security. Marshall paced the room, his mind racing. Calhoun's words echoed in his head. The system you protect, it's already falling apart. Here's something, Maya said, breaking the silence. One of these laptops has a message thread between Calhoun and his inner circle. They've been coordinating attacks, but there's more. She turned the screen toward them, showing a series of encrypted messages. They've been planning to release a massive data dump, files on police misconduct, corruption, everything they've collected over the years. Marshall leaned in. When? Maya's fingers flew across the keyboard. According to this, the release is scheduled for tomorrow. They're calling it Operation Exposure. Harris rubbed his temples. If that data goes public, it'll ignite a firestorm. The city's already on edge. This could push it over. Marshall felt a mix of dread and resolve. Where's the data stored? Maya frowned. It's on a secure server, but the messages suggest it's controlled from a remote location. I can track it, but it'll take time. We don't have time, Marshall said. We need to stop that release and find Calhoun before he can escalate further. Hours passed as Maya worked tirelessly to trace the server's location. The tension in the room was palpable. Harris stepped outside to make another call, leaving Marshall and Maya alone. Do you ever wonder if he's right? Maya asked suddenly. Marshall looked up. Who? Calhoun, Maya said, her voice quiet. About the system. About it being broken. Marshall hesitated. I know the system isn't perfect. It's flawed, and people have been hurt because of those flaws. But that doesn't justify what he's doing. You don't fix a broken system by burning everything to the ground. Maya nodded, though her expression remained troubled. I just hope we're on the right side of this. Before Marshall could respond, Harris re-entered the room. The commissioner's on high alert. He's agreed to go into protective custody until we neutralize the threat. Good, Marshall said. We can't afford to lose him. Maya's eyes lit up as she pointed to her screen. Got it. The server they're using is located in an old tech hub downtown. If we move fast, we can shut it down before the data goes live. Harris grabbed his coat. Let's go. We'll take a small team to avoid drawing attention. The tech hub was a relic of the city's past, a crumbling building that had once been a beacon of innovation. Now, it was abandoned, its windows boarded up and its halls silent. Marshall, Harris, and Maya approached cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. This place gives me the creeps, Maya muttered, her eyes darting around. Stay focused, Harris said. We're looking for the server room. They moved deeper into the building, guided by the schematics Maya had pulled up on her tablet. Eventually, they found the room. A small, heavily secured space filled with blinking servers and tangled cables. Maya got to work, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she bypassed the security protocols. Marshall and Harris stood guard, their eyes on the hallway. How long? Marshall asked. Not long, Maya replied. Just need tow. Her words were cut off by the sound of footsteps. Marshall tensed, raising his weapon. They're here, he said. A group of armed figures appeared at the end of the hallway, their faces obscured by masks. Without hesitation, they opened fire. Marshall and Harris returned fire, taking cover behind the doorframe. The confined space made every shot feel deafening. Maya, hurry, Harris shouted. I'm trying. She yelled back, her hands never stopping. Just fold them off. Marshall fired another shot, hitting one of the attackers. The others pressed forward, their determination clear. We're not going to be able to hold them much longer, Harris said. Almost there, Maya said, her voice tense. The attackers were closing in, their bullets tearing through the walls. Just as Marshall was about to make a desperate move, Maya shouted, Got it. The servers shut down. The screen went dark, and the room fell silent except for the sound of their breathing. Marshall and Harris exchanged a glance. Time to get out of here, Harris said. They retreated quickly, covering their tracks as they left the building. The attackers didn't pursue, likely realizing their operation had been compromised. Back in the car, Maya let out a shaky breath. We stopped the data dump, but this isn't over. Calhoun's still out there, and he won't stop until he's forced to. Marshall stared out the window, his resolve hardening. Then we force him. One way or another, this ends now. As they drove into the night, the city stretched out before them, a city on the brink, waiting for its reckoning. The next morning, the city felt like a powder keg, ready to ignite with the slightest spark. News of the failed data leak hadn't reached the public, but Marshall knew it was only a matter of time before Calhoun made his next move. At Harris's house, the team gathered around Maya's laptop, reviewing the evidence they'd recovered. Despite their recent victory, the tension was palpable. "I've decrypted more of the files," Maya said, her voice steady despite the fatigue in her eyes. "It's worse than we thought." They'd got detailed records on police misconduct, but also internal memos, financial irregularities, and evidence of cover-ups. Harris frowned. "If that information gets out, it'll destroy what little trust the public still has in law enforcement." Marshall leaned in, his jaw tight. "What about Calhoun? Any sign of where he might be hiding?" Maya shook her head. "Not yet, but I've set up alerts on all known associates. If he tries to reach out to anyone, we'll know." As they strategized, Harris's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. "It's the commissioner," he said, answering the call. "Yes, sir. Understood." He hung up and turned to the group. "That was the commissioner. He's addressing the press this afternoon. He wants to reassure the public that we're in control, but he's also issuing a warning to the shadow of justice." Marshall's eyes narrowed. "That's risky. If Calhoun sees it as a challenge, he might retaliate immediately." Harris nodded. "Which is why we're doubling security at the event. We need to be ready for anything." Maya glanced at the screen. "If Calhoun's planning something, he'll want maximum impact. We need to assume he'll target the press conference." Marshall's mind raced. "Then we make it impossible for him to succeed. Let's map out every possible entry point and assign teams to cover them. We're not giving him another opportunity to slip through our fingers." The press conference was held in front of City Hall, a high-profile location that offered both visibility and vulnerability. By the time the team arrived, the area was already bustling with activity. Reporters set up their cameras, officers patrolled the perimeter, and a growing crowd of onlookers gathered behind barricades. Marshall scanned the scene, his instincts on high alert. The atmosphere was tense, the air charged with anticipation. "We've got officers on every rooftop and all access points covered," Harris said, joining Marshall. "If Calhoun shows up, we'll be ready." Marshall nodded, but his unease remained. He knew how resourceful Calhoun was. If he had a plan, it wouldn't be straightforward. Maya joined them, holding a tablet linked to the Precinct's surveillance system. "I'll monitor the feeds from here," she said. "If anything unusual pops up, I'll alert you immediately." The commissioner stepped up to the podium, his expression resolute. The cameras zoomed in, and the crowd hushed as he began to speak. "Good afternoon," the commissioner said, his voice steady. "In recent days, our city has faced a serious threat from a group calling itself the Shadow of Justice. Let me be clear. We will not tolerate their attempts to undermine the safety and security of our community." The crowd murmured, a mix of support and skepticism rippling through the onlookers. "Their tactics are designed to sow fear and chaos," the commissioner continued. "But we will not be intimidated. We stand united, committed to justice and accountability." Marshall's attention shifted to the crowd. His eyes scanned the faces, looking for anything or anyone out of place. Maya's voice crackled through his earpiece. "Marshall, I'm picking up something strange on the south perimeter, Avengers Park, and it doesn't match any of the registered press vehicles." Marshall's pulse quickened. "I'm on it." He signaled to Harris, who followed as they made their way to the south side of the plaza. The van was nondescript, its windows tinted. Two men stood nearby, their demeanor casual but their eyes constantly scanning the area. "They don't look like reporters," Harris muttered. Marshall approached, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Excuse me, gentlemen, can I see some identification?" The men exchanged a glance, then bolted. "Stop," Marshall shouted, giving chase. Harris called for backup as they pursued the suspects through the crowded streets. The chase was chaotic, weaving through traffic and pedestrians. Marshall closed the gap, tackling one of the men to the ground. The suspect struggled, but Marshall pinned him, quickly cuffing his hands. Harris caught up moments later, securing the second man with the help of another officer. "Who are you working for?" Marshall demanded, but the man remained silent, his jaw set. Maya's voice came through the earpiece again. "Guys, you're not going to believe this." The van was rigged with surveillance equipment. They were streaming the press conference, live to a remote server. Marshall's heart sank. They were feeding Calhoun intel in real time. Harris's face darkened. "He's been watching our every move." Before they could process the implications, an explosion rocked the plaza. The ground shook, and a plume of smoke rose from the north side of City Hall. Marshall's blood ran cold. "Maya, what's happening?" Her voice was frantic. "There's been a blast near the barricades. Multiple injuries reported." Marshall and Harris raced back to the plaza, their worst fears realized. The scene was chaos, people screaming, officers scrambling, and debris scattered everywhere. The commissioner was being rushed to safety, his face pale but uninjured. Marshall's eyes locked onto the epicenter of the explosion. Amid the smoke and rubble, a chilling sight caught his attention. A banner draped over a damaged barricade, its message unmistakable. "This is just the beginning." Marshall's fists clenched. Calhoun had struck again, and this time the consequences were devastating. As the sirens wailed and the chaos unfolded, Marshall knew the final confrontation was looming. Calhoun had declared war, and it was time to bring him down, once and for all. The aftermath of the explosion left City Hall in chaos. Paramedics worked frantically to tend to the injured, while officers struggled to maintain order. The commissioner's voice crackled over the radio, issuing commands to secure the area and begin an immediate investigation. Marshall stood amidst the wreckage, his mind racing. The shadow of justice had just raised the stakes again. This wasn't a simple attack. It was a declaration of their intent to dismantle the system, piece by piece. "We can't let them slip away," Marshall said, his voice tight with urgency. He turned to Harris and Maya, who were regrouping near the surveillance van. They knew exactly where to strike and when. They got eyes everywhere. Maya nodded, her fingers flying across her tablet. "I've been analyzing the data from the van's equipment. They were streaming live to an encrypted server. If I can break through, we might be able to pinpoint Calhoun's location." Harris scanned the damaged plaza. "Made it quick. We're running out of time." Marshall's earpiece crackled with a report from one of the officers. "We've got witnesses saying they saw someone matching Calhoun's description leaving the area just before the explosion." Marshall's grip on his radio tightened. "Direction?" "Headed east, toward the old train station," the officer replied. Harris' eyes narrowed. The train station's been abandoned for years. If Calhoun's using it as a base, it makes sense. It's isolated, easy to secure. Maya glanced up from her screen. That might explain this. She turned the tablet toward them, revealing a set of coordinates. "I've traced the server's signal. It's coming from the same area." Marshall's jaw clenched. "This is it. We've got him." The drive to the train station was tense, every second filled with anticipation. Marshall and Harris led a small team of officers, their vehicles cutting through the deserted streets. Maya remained in constant contact, feeding them updates as they closed in. The station loomed ahead, its once grand facade now a crumbling relic of the past. The surrounding area was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that set Marshall's nerves on edge. They parked a block away and approached on foot, their weapons ready. Harris signaled for the team to spread out, covering all exits. Maya's voice came through the earpiece. "Be careful. I'm picking up movement inside." Marshall nodded, his heart pounding. "We move in on my signal." They breached the station through a side entrance, their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty halls. The air was thick with dust and the faint smell of rusting metal. Marshall led the way, his eyes scanning every shadow. They passed through the ticketing area, now littered with debris, and moved toward the main terminal. The faint hum of electronic equipment grew louder with each step. They found the source in what had once been the station's control room. Computers and monitors were set up in a makeshift command center, their screens displaying surveillance feeds from across the city. Calhoun stood at the center of it all, his back to them, calmly typing on a keyboard. "Hands where we can see them, Calhoun," Marshall shouted, his weapon trained on the man. Calhoun didn't flinch. Slowly, he raised his hands and turned to face them, a smug smile on his face. "I was wondering when you'd catch up." "Step away from the computer," Harris ordered. Calhoun complied, his movements deliberate. "You put on quite the show today," he said, "but you're too late. The seeds have already been sown." Marshall moved closer, his weapon steady. "Your game is over. The attacks, the leaks, it ends now." Calhoun chuckled, his eyes gleaming with defiance. "You think arresting me will stop this? You're only cutting off one head. The movement will continue, with or without me." Before Marshall could respond, a sudden alarm blared from one of the monitors. Maya's voice came through the earpiece, urgent and sharp. "Marshall, the system's been triggered. He's initiating a remote data dump." Calhoun's smirk widened. "You can't stop the truth." Marshall rushed to the computer, but the screen was locked with a countdown ticking ominously. 15 minutes until the files were released. "Maya, we need you to shut this down," Marshall said, his voice taut. "I'm on it," she replied, "but it's heavily encrypted. It'll take time." Harris grabbed Calhoun and pushed him into a chair. You're going to tell us how to stop it. Calhoun leaned back, his expression smug. Why would I do that? The truth deserves to be free. Marshall slammed his hand on the table. This isn't about truth. It's about chaos. How many more people need to get hurt before you're satisfied? Calhoun's gaze hardened. As many as it takes to bring the system to its knees. Maya's voice interrupted. Marshall, I've breached the first layer, but it's going to be close. Marshall turned back to Calhoun, his patience wearing thin. You can't win this. Whatever you think you're fighting for, this isn't the way. For a moment, Calhoun's expression faltered, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. You'll see, he said quietly. When the people rise, you'll see. Marshall clenched his fists, but he knew arguing was pointless. He turned his focus to the countdown, willing Maya to work faster. The minutes ticked by, the tension in the room palpable. Harris kept a close eye on Calhoun, ready for any sudden moves. Finally, Maya's voice came through, triumphant. Got it. The data dump is stopped. The countdown disappeared from the screen, replaced by a blank terminal. Marshall exhaled, relief washing over him. Good work, Maya. Harris pulled Calhoun to his feet. You're done. Let's go. As they escorted Calhoun out, he looked back at the command center, his expression unreadable. You may have won this round, but the fight isn't over. Marshall didn't respond. He knew Calhoun was right in one sense. The fight for justice was far from over. But for now, they had stopped a devastating blow, and that was a victory worth holding on to. As they stepped out into the daylight, Marshall allowed himself a moment of hope. The city had been pushed to the brink, but today they had pulled it back. The drive back to the precinct was quiet, each person lost in their thoughts. Calhoun sat cuffed in the back seat, his smug expression unchanged despite the gravity of his situation. Marshall couldn't help but feel that the man had something else up his sleeve. At the precinct, the media frenzy was already in full swing. Reporters crowded the entrance, shouting questions as officers escorted Calhoun inside. Flashing cameras captured every moment, the city desperate for answers after the chaos of the past few days. Marshall and Harris pushed through the crowd, determined to get Calhoun secured before anything else could go wrong. Inside, the commissioner was waiting, his face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Well done, the commissioner said, his voice low. Calhoun's arrest will send a strong message. Marshall nodded but kept his expression neutral. This isn't over. He's got loyal followers out there, and they're not going to stop just because we got him. The commissioner sighed. We'll deal with them. For now, let's focus on making sure he stays behind bars. As Calhoun was led to an interrogation room, Maya appeared, a stack of documents in hand. I've gone through everything we pulled from the warehouse. There's enough here to implicate dozens of people, from local activists to former officials. If we play this right, we can dismantle the shadow of justice's entire network. Harris glanced at the documents. We'll need to be careful. If we push too hard, we risk turning them into martyrs. Marshall nodded. We don't need martyrs. We need accountability. In the interrogation room, Calhoun sat across from Marshall and Harris, his hands cuffed to the table. Despite his situation, his confidence remained unshaken. You think this changes anything? Calhoun said, his voice calm. Arresting me only proves my point. The system is designed to silence anyone who challenges it. Marshall leaned forward, his eyes locked on Calhoun's. You're not a hero, you're a terrorist. You've hurt innocent people to push your agenda. Calhoun's smile faded slightly. And how many innocent people has your system hurt? How many lives destroyed in the name of law and order? Marshall didn't flinch. I won't deny the system has flaws, but violence isn't the answer. It never is. Calhoun shook his head. You're clinging to a broken machine, officer, and sooner or later, it will collapse under its own weight. Harris cut in. If you care so much about justice, help us. Tell us where your remaining cells are hiding, and maybe we can prevent more bloodshed. Calhoun's eyes narrowed. Justice isn't something you can negotiate. It's something you fight for. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Marshall stood, his patience worn thin. Enjoy your fight from a prison cell. Later that evening, Marshall sat at his desk, reviewing the reports from the day's events. The precinct was quieter now, the chaos of the press conference and Calhoun's arrest finally subsiding. Maya approached, her expression thoughtful. You okay? Marshall nodded, though he didn't feel it. It's been a long few days. She pulled up a chair. We made a difference today. Calhoun's behind bars, and his network is vulnerable. That's a win. Marshall leaned back, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Yeah, but for how long? There's always another fight, another group ready to rise up. Maya placed a hand on his shoulder. That's why we keep going, one step at a time. Marshall offered a small smile. Thanks, Maya. The next morning, the city woke to headlines declaring Calhoun's arrest as a major victory for law enforcement. The commissioner held another press conference, vowing to rebuild trust and address the systemic issues that had fueled groups like the Shadow of Justice. But for Marshall, the work was just beginning. He knew that true change wouldn't come from a single arrest or a few policy reforms. It would take time, commitment, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. As he prepared for another day, Marshall felt a renewed sense of purpose. The city was far from perfect, but it was worth fighting for. And as long as people like Maya Harris and the rest of his team stood by his side, he knew they could make a difference. Outside, the city buzzed with life, its resilience shining through the cracks. For the first time in days, Marshall allowed himself a moment of hope. The fight wasn't over, but they were ready for whatever came next. And this time, they wouldn't back down.